Deadlines. There's loads of them, and this Wednesday is one of the key ones for general practice. As the phase 3, part of the COVID vaccination enhanced service, is due, and it'll be the key question of whether or not practices and networks participate to deliver COVID vaccinations in terms of the phase 3, as well as how they will then deliver their flu vaccinations on top of that. So we're going to be talking about that key document in this episode, as well as a significant update in terms of the GPDPR changes and processes that you will absolutely need to know about. We're going to tech enhance your primary care learning. Let's get started. Hey, GP learners, and you've got myself, Gandhi, and Andy joining today to talk about enhanced services. How are we doing there, Andy?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been another tiring week. Feels like it's relentless, never ending for those of us who might be in the position of running a practice or primary care network or involved in planning and delivery of primary care. Never a dull day.
Seems like the gas has not absolutely in any way, shape or form been released, and yeah, like you say, it's difficult, and we've got an interesting deadline that we need to achieve by 4 days from the time where this stream's going out. So yeah, interesting one to say the least, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So COVID phase 3 vaccination deadline Wednesday, so we're having quite a lot of discussions in our primary care network on that topic. How's things going for you, Gandhi, in your area?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting part. So for those that aren't aware, about 7 days ago, well, probably a little bit longer actually, we had the documents talking about the COVID phase 3 vaccination plan. So this is how you deliver the potential booster vaccination to those patients over the 58 years or plus, or those in the clinically extremely vulnerable groups, etc. Basically those most vulnerable to COVID itself, with the plans that they will potentially need a third booster. And the plans have been released to basically explain how primary care can help support that vaccination aims. And obviously this pairs up massively with our flu campaigns, which will be going on at pretty much the same time. So our plan for this session is to go through the various documents and to explain what they mean, what implications this has for you as a practice, as a network, and all that kind of information that you need. And then just after that, we're going to give you some significant updates to the GPDPR changes that have happened. And these are seismic changes to what was originally planned. So definitely stick around for that. So Andy, shall we start going off with the COVID vaccination stuff? I'm swinging over to your screen.
Yep.
There we go.
Gosh, we're somewhere in the middle of the document. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of pages to get through if we take our sort of traditional approach. So and I think a lot of people will have spent a lot of time already with the documents. So I think our suggestion today is that we go through and really have a bit more of a conversation about some of the points within the document that might be sort of talking or sticking points for primary care. So that's the approach we're taking today. We've got the main document. Then we've got we'll talk about the designation process for designated sites, and then I think we'll just finish just highlighting where people can find the timeline again if they've lost it amongst all the documents, and just looking at the key deadlines as people move through to hopefully trying to deliver this enhanced service. I'm interested to see the comments of people out there from other parts of the country as well, because I'm aware in Nottingham we had quite a different delivery model for the first phases of COVID vaccination, where general practice subcontracted to like the LRF, sort of local response force, which was a broad collaboration of different organisations in Nottinghamshire who worked together to deliver COVID vaccines very successfully, but with a focus on sites separate to GP sites. So I'm wondering if in some parts of the country this perhaps is causing less ripples even than in our area, because we're having to potentially do the work to deliver this at a more local level and more closer to primary care that may have already been done elsewhere. So I'm really interested to see how this is landing in other parts of the country as well.
Absolutely. So if you are joining us live and watching us, feel free to stick any questions or comments in the chat and stuff, and we'll happily try and respond and include them in terms of the discussion we're going through. As Andy said, I think there are some areas where this document is not going to be a challenge. And I think there's going to be some areas of the country where this document is going to be, simply put, the craziest amount of work that they'll ever have to consider. So it's going to be an interesting spectrum that we'll be trying to cover for all of you watching us, and if you're watching this on the replay and stuff. But let's get cracking, shall we, Andy?
Yeah, so this is the document. It's a very familiar format for us now. We've been reviewing a lot of these documents coming out during the COVID era. contents, always a good place to orientate yourself, but let's breeze through that. So this sort of introduces the key requirements of the enhanced service. I'm just going to sort of zero in on a bit that always causes controversy and is causing some anxiety amongst my PCN practices, and this is the potential requirement or the need to have the ability to deliver vaccine 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 7 days a week. And I think the wording is really key here. Do you think that we would be asked to actually do that, Gandhi? Because that feels like a really, really difficult ask to just run all the time doing COVID vaccination. And also, are we aware that places have been asked to do this during phase 1 or 2, or was this something that was never really enacted by NHS England?
I think the key word in that entire lining is the ability to deliver 8 to 8, not necessarily that you have to actually do it. And the reason for that, a lot of people will be aware that with some of the vaccines, there is significant pressures in terms of how you can deliver the vaccines once they arrive with yourself. So you've only got a few days potentially to use the entire supply that you have, and making sure that that's done appropriately so we don't waste vaccines. And I guess the key thing that obviously comes with that is if you get a delivery, for example, on a Friday, because that's where the supply chain is, you don't want to lose 2 days out of potentially your 5 or 7 day time frame to deliver the number of vaccines that you've been given. So I think the wording is just to encompass that element of things. However, I think one thing that is important for people to recognize is that increasingly we are seeing that obviously as we move back towards whatever normality is, people are working now. It's not the same situation where previously people were isolating completely from lockdown and all the other kind of stuff. So having the capacity to deliver some of these timeframes for delivery outside of working hours may mean that you actually get better ability to vaccinate patients. So I think there does need to be that consideration for various centres to think, actually, whilst it may be a little bit more challenging to create clinics that work outside of working hours, actually you're more likely to get a better potential hit rate for people wanting to have them done because they're not having to take time off work to come and have their vaccine done. So maybe there is that part to consider. But I think the majority of this is, like I said, just trying to make sure that you're not caught foul of having to have the wrong delivery time and that kind of stuff that makes it more challenging for you.
Yeah, really good point. I think evenings, weekend clinics would be really popular with a lot of patients and would drive uptake. That's a really good point. I'm trying to encourage my practice not to be too afraid of this paragraph. And I say I'm not aware that anywhere has been forced to open at very unreasonable places in other parts of the country. Though please tell us in the comments if you've had that experience. So commonly used terms, I think we're all familiar with these things. Defines for us what a GP practice is, for example.
If you don't know.
So background and duration. So I'm aware it's a tight period of time to sign up. And I know it's difficult for PCNs to be fully confident that they can deliver, that their designated site will be suitable, will be approved, and that they can have all their ducks in order to actually deliver when they need to start delivering vaccines. So a lot of people have been asking questions about, well, can we sign up and then withdraw later if we do sign up in good faith and it turns out that we just literally cannot deliver on it? What would be the consequences for that? And I believe Nikki indicated that practices could, so correct me if I'm wrong here because I wasn't at the webinar, but that practices could sign up and then back out if they did so in good faith and had good reason for backing out. Although that's not technically what this document actually says. And again, this is an area where practices have some anxiety. Would there be penalties if they signed up in good faith and then had to withdraw? Obviously, that'd be really chaotic for the vaccination program, and the region would have to find another way to deliver that vaccine. So that would be a very serious thing. But were they to pull out, would there be penalties? Do you have any more information about that, Gandhi?
So I'm not aware of any penalties as such. Obviously, there is the 42-day time frame if you were to back out, that you would still have to deliver the vaccination program for. You can't just say, right, I'm off and up to you to sort it out. No, you still have to continue delivering for at least a 6-week period. And as you said, I'm not aware of any penalties as such. I guess the key thing is that the payments do work about a month and a bit in lieu as such. So could NHS England do something with that? Maybe. I don't know. It's that good faith element of things. And I think it's also recognizing what is the reason that a network or a practice is pulling out. If it's just for the sake of, well, we don't want to deliver it for the whole 5 months, I think NHS England will probably take a very dim view of that. If it's actually, business as usual has got to the point where the network can no longer deliver the vaccination schedule, because don't forget, moving towards the tail end of this, we are heading into winter period, and practices are clearly going to have to prioritise the care of patients as well, rather than trying to deliver an additional enhanced service, then that may be an impact in terms of what they continue to do and stuff. So yeah, not aware of any actual penalties and stuff, and if people are, feel free to let us know in the chat and stuff. But I think as long as it's done in sensible good faith, I can't imagine that NHS England would have any issues, particularly if you're citing the fact this is patient safety is the reason that you're having to stop. I would see it's really hard for anybody to turn around and say, well, no, you're saying you can't deliver a service because it's impacting your patient safety, but we still want you to do it. That's deadly territory to be in, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there'd be a conversation, wouldn't there, about the amount of vaccine delivered under the enhanced service, and and what would happen in those circumstances. I'm also interested what happens if people sign up and then they just they literally cannot deliver. It emerges a week after they've signed up that they just cannot deliver. And I think those were the circumstances where they were suggesting maybe the 42 days might not apply. But I'm sure it's in the letter of the contract, so I think there's going to be a conversation about whether to release practices on that obligation. Although the indication is that they might. There's more details.
With the sign-up period, there is also that 2-week period that CCG will be engaging with practices to confirm that their plans are actually viable. So it's no good just saying, yeah, we're going to do it, but then actually submitting plans that clearly don't seem viable. I think there will be an element of NHS England CCG reviewing all of those plans, just like there was when these sites were set up back in January and stuff. And there were occasions I remember that some places were told that they felt that they had everything right, but then actually NHS England turned around and said, no, actually this isn't suitable. So just being aware that just because you're saying yes doesn't mean you might still be doing it.
True, and I suppose that's an exit point if you really want to work up a workable plan, and you sign up in good faith thinking that you can and then you can't, then obviously that's an exit point. So that's good to know. So another issue which came up with the other enhanced services earlier in the year around COVID vaccination, and this time is this issue about being joint and several owners of the vaccine, and what this means for perhaps situations where vaccine might be lost, or there might be issues with vaccine storage. So you're in a lift building, Gandhi, like us. We're in a lift building. It was built in 2012, and we have a power cut about once every 6 months.
Right.
Yeah, a water storage tank, which was thought the best place for this in the building was directly above the GP practice, has burst and flooded us. We have had multiple issues with, all sorts of issues with what should be a new and functioning building. That's another story, but we've lost vaccine on a number of occasions over the nearly 10 years that we've been in that building. And it could happen during this period, particularly as 2 of the largest practices in our primary care network are located in that lift building, and they have the best, they have extensive, they have the most fridge capacity in the primary care network. So what happens if vaccine is lost is a problem for us? Do you have any answers?
So no official answers. My impression would be that as long as you've been doing everything that you're asked to do in terms of monitoring and everything else, there are clearly going to be situations where things are just beyond people's control. So like you say, if the building suddenly floods because something broke and you weren't aware that that was an issue, well, that's where things like your business insurance and all that kind of stuff kicks into play. But are you directly liable? No. If, however, somebody didn't check the fridge readings for a few days, and therefore, as a result of that, you've lost vaccines because the fridge was left open because no one had bothered to check it for a couple of days or so, that's a different matter. That there is an element of responsibility there, and obviously that's something that you should be doing, simply put. So I think it comes down to the motive. It's like with anything, it's motive or intent, shall we say? And as long as it's completely accidental, how can you blame someone for something that is beyond your control? Yes, there is the issue of lost vaccines, absolutely, and that is a key issue, particularly since obviously small volume of stuff can mean life-saving treatments for a significant amount of people. But at the same time, as long as you've done everything you should be doing, that's fine. It's when people try and cut corners or get lackadaisical about it, or clearly they haven't done what they should have been doing. And that's where the oversight and making sure that you've got good governance process and stuff comes into play.
So that's all well and good, but that's not what the contract says. It just says that you're joined several owners. And, you know, I've asked locally for reassurance from sort of CCG figures locally, and they are very reassuring verbally in what they say. But reassurance in writing is less forthcoming. And, you know, having been involved through these sort of loss of vaccine situations, often what happens is people kind of push the responsibility book around a little bit, and they say, oh no, you should claim on your insurance. No, the building company should claim on their insurance. And it can become very difficult. So I think it is a reasonable challenge, although what the CCG representatives said to us is that they are not aware of anywhere in the country where there's been an incident of vaccine loss where a GP practice has had to foot the bill for that loss. And there's been a lot of vaccine activity going on, so maybe we can draw some reassurance from that.
Like you say, I think trying to assign direct liability is a challenge in terms of whose insurance it gets paid on and stuff. That's a bit more challenging because obviously the PCN directly can't actually have insurance because it's not a legal entity. So I think that's where partly some of the difficulty that have come into play. But like you say, I think that particular line is just to make reference that if you're part of this PCN delivery mechanism, then simply put, you're all jointly involved in this. It's not just the responsibility of the lead practice to make sure this happens. And I think that's the key focus for a lot of this, because obviously there are some practices that are taking that responsibility of being the lead practice for delivery. But I do like the fact the document makes it clear it's not just their responsibility to make sure this happens. And that's really important to me.
So you think the intention is to mitigate the perception of risk for the lead practice rather than necessarily to increase the risk concern for all practices? And I think actually on second reading, that's probably an intention of that sentence. That's helpful. Thanks for helping me interpret that, Gandhi. So yeah, as ever, these documents can be varied, subject to ministerial decision. So after you've signed up, it can vary. I don't think we're aware of anything that's been unreasonably or controversially changed in these sorts of documents afterwards, although people have in the past been worried about those sorts of paragraphs. You worried about that?
We saw that with the phase 1 and phase 2 documents, didn't we? So we discussed, similar versions of these when they originally came out. And obviously one of the key things that we know that the vaccine delivery can change. So obviously originally way back when this all kicked off, there was the element that everybody had to wait 15 minutes, that it had to be, signed off by a GP and nobody else, and all these other kind of significant restrictions because it was a new vaccine. And then over time, we've learned that actually some of those things are not as valuable. So for example, things like 15-minute wait time got adjusted to, just being if you were driving, not necessarily every single person that has it, so that allows those changes to make it more flexible to happen. Yes, there is clearly still the risk that they could end up putting something really frustrating and challenging in there. I think that should not be the aim, and I know Nikki in particular has been very clear to try and say they will try their best to make sure this is as deliverable as possible, in line with the guidance that they're given from various other organizations like the vaccine providers, like the MRHA and that kind of stuff. So it's important to remember that that is there to try and hopefully mean that they can be as flexible as possible. Does it mean that, yes, it can be made punitively? Possibly. But I think, again, if NHS England tried to do that significantly, they would lose a lot of faith with any further delivery mechanisms. And obviously that has impact later down the line. And I guess one of the key things to remember, this is now, this is also setting up collaborative working for the future, so we're talking about COVID vaccinations now, flu vaccinations and stuff, but moving forward, this could easily be adapted to change to deliver other kinds of PCN services, and in a sense, force PCNs to do it that way, whether that's right or wrong. That is a much bigger discussion topic. And maybe when we might get into our comments and stuff, but for now, let's crack on with the document, shall we?
We're saving that for later, are we?
Yeah.
Okay. So, just keeping on going. Sign up is always with highlighting that the deadline is Wednesday, so keep your eye on the clock, and we'll be looking at the schedule for the implementation of this enhanced service in a few moments. So this issue about the designated site is really key, isn't it? And I think a lot of areas will have already been using a designated site in their sort of phase 1 to existing COVID vaccination rollouts. But for some areas, this is a new process, like ourselves. So there's some intense activity going on to identify the right sort of premises and real estate. Yeah, how are you guys doing identifying a designated site sort of over in your primary care network, Andy?
I think part of the challenge is it's not easy, and I think anywhere that says that it's easy is lying. There are definitely places that are, like you said, a few months ahead of us in terms of what they've done because of the different system that Nottingham in particular has taken. But I think trying to find a single deliverable site across a population is challenging because particularly in, I think, areas of deprivation and inner city areas in particular, we know our patients hate to travel because they either don't have the means or they don't have the motive and that kind of stuff to do so, and that therefore makes it more difficult compared to if you're typically more suburban or affluent areas and stuff. That doesn't mean that they don't have other challenges, they absolutely do, but those are particularly some of the stuff that keeps coming up in our particular network, that patients in one end of the network aren't going to travel to another end just to have a vaccine. So that's an issue. I think the other part is finding the estates, because doing it within primary care estates is really challenging when we're already being asked to house various additional roles, for example, when we are trying to get back to, or not get back to, but continuing to deliver business as usual, and more importantly, delivering business as usual plus about 50%, which is what it's felt like for the past 6 months in particular, and has no signs of reducing any way, shape or form in that sense. So I think finding a site is really difficult. We potentially have got some sites, and looking outside of possibly general practice estates is a real key part of that, I think. And I think that what most networks will have to do is look outside of their own physical estates and lean on community partners, CCG partners and that kind of stuff, or possibly going really innovative. So a couple of colleagues have commented on social media and stuff, and hats off to him. One person in particular, Craig Nicollick, who is, for me, one of the best people at figuring out how to do some of this stuff, to be honest. But he's talked about approaching empty warehouses and empty businesses that unfortunately have had to change and close because of COVID. But there are some significant sites that are just vacant at the moment, and approaching them and saying, look, we want to deliver a vaccination schedule, can you offer us this at really reduced cost or possibly even no cost? And there you've got your physical estate, and it's just sticking all the stuff in. And sticking a porta cabin, for example, somewhere is not really difficult if you've got the people helping you and supporting you to do it, potentially. So yeah, what do you think?
I think it's challenging. It's been really interesting to reflect on the sort of estate that we have in the primary care network, actually, because we have a number of practices who have fairly new premises, sort of built 2012 or that kind of era, and it's just interesting that they were not designed with separate in and out flow of patient and social distancing in mind at all. In fact, our two largest practices are up a single flight of stairs in a lift building with, you have to use the one single flight of stairs to get up and down, or one of two lifts which are co-located with the stairwell.
Despite being built post SARS as well, which should have been a lesson,
Yeah, it's just really interesting. I'd be interested to see how the architecture of designing general practice buildings changes post-pandemic, and it'd be lovely to do a session on that at some stage. Yeah, it's really challenging, and I think it's about the conversations that you have with these other providers of space. So, for example, last year we delivered our flu campaign from a sports hall, which is sort of co-located within the youth services element of the joint service centre where our practice is. And the landlords were quite flexible about the use of that, but that's because they weren't using the youth centre at that stage and there wasn't anything else happening in the sports hall. But everything is restarting now. So I think the availability of these alternative spaces is different now and more difficult. So yeah, we're finding it challenging. We've also found there's already a really quite good community pharmacy COVID vaccination clinic sat right where we would like to site our primary care network COVID vaccination clinic as well. So we're beginning to have all sorts of quite interesting, and I think for the future, quite beneficial conversations around collaboration, and the competitive environment that has existed
Mm-hmm.
between general practice and community pharmacy on issues of flu vaccine in the past. So it's causing some interesting conversations. But yeah, it's a challenge. Hopefully we'll get there.
So did you want to talk about that complexity between general practice and pharmacy delivery now, or should we leave that towards the end? Because that is a point worth picking up on, I think.
Yeah, we can talk about it now, really. So interesting. So we had so the community pharmacy that shares our building, really innovative community pharmacist actually, and he's been involved in providing really quite successful, well managed, well run COVID vaccination centres, both in Mansfield and also from the library area of our joint service centre, which is quite suitable for in-outflow. And the kind of community rooms of the library do lend themselves to being configured for delivering vaccination programs. You can people can flow in and out separately and so forth. So it's really quite good. And we collaborated with them to provide some local vaccination slots for targeted patients within our primary care network. And that actually worked really quite well. Disappointing uptake, but really quite well. We were able to deliver 2 streams of patients and 2 streams of vaccine storage and separate preparation and recording simultaneously. It was really quite impressive. So there are the seeds of collaboration there, but also what's been happening for the past few years, and I'm sure everyone working in community pharmacy and general practice out there will be aware, there's been a bit of competition around flu vaccinations. So traditionally, general practice has delivered flu vaccines on an enhanced service where there is a payment per flu vaccine administered, and general practice has notified its at-risk groups and got them in to general practice in dedicated clinics or ad hoc, grab the patient when they're in about something else, methods to vaccinate the population. And that's worked quite well. In recent years, community pharmacy have been able to collect a fee for providing flu vaccine as well. And that's meant that community pharmacists have an incentive to do that. So often when patients are in for their repeat prescription to collect, they might be offered a flu vaccine by their community pharmacist. And that's actually really good, really convenient for the patient. So I can't knock that at all. But it creates an environment where general practice sometimes feels that things that it has traditionally done and built into its business model and financial projections as a small business are being poached by other people, by community pharmacy, or that's sometimes how it's sort of taken within general practice. And the fear we have, particularly in our area, and I'm sure people are experiencing it elsewhere, we've got a large COVID vaccination hub, right underneath, right next to the entrance to 2 of our biggest practices. And it's likely that centre will probably be co-administering flu vaccine along with the COVID vaccines to patients who are eligible. One imagines that's going to happen. So the practices are really concerned that a lot of the people who would have previously had their flu jab in previous years at the practice are going to get sort of diverted at the front door into the COVID vaccination centre and have their flu jab there. And the problem is that practices ordered their flu vaccine back in sort of January, February time this year, based on the predicted volume of flu vaccines they expected to do, and they have to pay for that vaccine, and they have to take delivery of it, and they will vaccine would be wasted, and they will lose lose money on that vaccine and lose the fees for those patients who might end up vaccinated elsewhere. So there's a bit of anxiety in our area about this competition with community pharmacy. But I'd say I'm always hopeful and optimistic about collaboration. And I do wonder if actually in the greater good of vaccinating the most patients that we can, coming up to what will be a really difficult winter from a flu and COVID perspective for the NHS, I think that really should be our priority. And I'm hopeful that there are ways to collaborate that protects everybody's business model, but means that we can just vaccinate more people. So that's the issue. I mean, have you got any thoughts on that, Gandhi, or how to address it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've identified the key points. I think one of the things to remember, and this is, I think, where a lot of the frustrations from general practice perspective with this whole situation comes, is that there are different rules applied to general practice in terms of delivering flu compared to the pharmacy chains and stuff from delivering flu vaccinations. And the key one is the delivery mechanism. As you mentioned, general practice has to order its flu vaccines in January, February time for delivery in September, October, whereas a pharmacist or pharmacy chain or whatever can actually order vaccines pretty much on a day-by-day basis. They can put an order in and have a supply potentially within a few days, which means that their flexibility and, more importantly, the risk of not having used vaccines is considerably less. And that's a challenge for practice, because practice have to pay for those vaccines. They have to pay for the workforce and everything that goes in terms of delivering a campaign, which is a significant amount of work. It's not a small thing to deliver vaccinations to several hundreds or several thousand patients. You know, it's a significant amount of work that practices go through just to then realize that somebody else can take that away from you at the drop of a hat. And I think it's the fact that there are different rules that apply, different mechanisms that go into this, that mean that it is easier for one type of service to deliver a vaccine compared to another. And it just makes it feel very unfair to general practice on that basis. I think that being competition, in my view, is not necessarily a problem, because actually, as you said, for the patients, they get a better potential service in terms of choice. But I think if that's the case, then you have to have equal rules. And if you don't have equal rules, then that's where the problem comes into play. And I understand, for me, it's the supply chain aspect of this that's always been the unfair element to it. I think collaborating between primary care and pharmacy services to deliver a better service, actually, I agree, is probably a good way of trying to deliver this. But then there needs to be that both acceptance of a benefit of risk and a benefit of gain from this, and equality when it comes to that. And that's where I think this gets really complicated, because everyone just wants to protect their own little silo, to be honest, and break down those barriers. I think for places where they've been able to break down those barriers have been really positive. I think for areas where they haven't, obviously, it's not been as nice as it could be. And unfortunately, there's always an element of antagonism that still goes on. I mean, we saw a couple of weeks ago where the CEO of a local pharmacy chain that is actually based where you and I both live happened to slam the entire primary care and general practice significantly, to the point where actually I think he was shamed into giving a public apology, quite rightly so, because his comments were inaccurate and false. And that's put a lot of our blood between many practices and one particular significantly large pharmacy chain and stuff. So, those are feelings that are hard to challenge, and working collaboratively then comes from a point of opposition, shall we say.
Yeah. So Gandhi, I'm going to ask you about the future of, because it feels like it's the right moment.
Okay.
The future of of flu vaccination programs going forwards. So obviously, this is nothing to do with flu. Actually, this enhanced service, this is just about COVID. It only touches on flu vaccines in that it states that they can and should be co-administered where possible. Because that's a more efficient use of resources and services. Flu, we have seen but I'm wondering if we can read something into the future intentions of NHS England here, or maybe I'm just obsessed with crystal ball gazing. But so we had the enhanced service for pharmacies to deliver flu vaccines. That's been around for a number of years now. Flu targets were incorporated in the Impact Investment Fund for primary care networks, and that funding is provided to primary care networks irrespective of whether that's delivered in a community pharmacy setting or in general practice setting. And that document sort of specifically talks about collaboration with community pharmacy. This document does talk in places about collaboration with community pharmacy, and the subcontracting sections have been a particular interest for me because of our specific circumstances in our primary care network. But it is quite enabling of collaboration with community partners. I'm just wondering, is that the direction of travel? Are we going to see less flu in general practice and more in other settings going forwards?
So I think some people say it's a cynical view. I'd say it's a realistic view. The PCN-DES was created with a view for collaborative working across footprints, whether that was practices or wider community partners. I suspect this is the way that NHS England are trying to drive through the fact that practice-based delivery is not the future of general practice and primary care. It is, regional-based delivery, whether that is a PCN footprint and potentially even sometimes larger than that, because that's what the government seems to want at this point in time. Collaborating with community partners may enhance that, and obviously mean that there can be different savings in cost and stuff, I assume is what the viewpoint may be. And we are seeing it time and time again. There is no funds going directly to general practices to support a lot of the new work that's coming through. It's all going through PCNs, and therefore PCN delivery is the focus. Did that answer the question?
I think so. We don't know, do we? But I think
we don't know. We're speculating and opinionating, and
you could read that as a direction of travel in the manoeuvres, you know, around the delivery of the COVID vaccination. And
we're seeing it with, as you said, we're seeing that with COVID vaccinations. Flu, by nature of the mechanism, has been twinned with that for this particular time. Could that be done for things like cervical smears? Spirometry, which is going to be a key one, I think, moving forward, because of the change in the guidance about spirometry. I mean, we talked about this before as well, haven't we? Yeah, I think there are increasingly going to be elements of PCN-based delivery of services rather than practice-based delivery of services. And that is a massive thing, I think, for certain areas and practices to get their heads around. Ourselves included, because both you and I are obviously clinical directors at this moment in time, and you know, that's a factor that we have to balance and judge and play with and stuff. So, yeah. We should crack on with the document, shouldn't we?
We should. Should we adjust John's comment now, or are we saving that for later?
Okay, let's go for it. So John's made a really appropriate comment. Let me just bring it on for everyone to read. So thank you, John, for the comment. So how are PCNs managing the situation where some practices agree and others refuse to take part? Is the PCN responsible for all patients or only for patients or practices who have agreed to take part? What are your thoughts, Andy?
So this question's been asked at some of the local briefings in our area, and the answer we've got, and I think this potentially has an element of scaremongering, or you know, invoking big bad community pharmacy taking away our vaccine business sort of tactic to it. But they've talked about community pharmacy plugging gaps that can't be met by primary care. That's generally been the answer. Although one wonders, and actually spending some time with the document, I think there are mechanisms for practices who are not the registered practice but are in the PCN area to deliver vaccines for those patients. Whilst I don't have a specific answer, I suspect that the answer will be that the local NHS sort of, you know, area representatives would have a conversation with the primary care network and agree a local solution that might involve leaning on community pharmacy and bringing community pharmacy in more, and yet Boots might, you know, want to step in some areas, or even nationally, to start delivering, you know, more of this vaccination work. It might be quite lucrative for them with their economies of scale, but other smaller players might want to play a part. And also part of the solution might be, actually, if there's capacity within the rest of the practices within the primary care network, then I could see them being a big part of that solution as well. And, you know, taking is it £10.50-ish, whatever, the flu in one arm, and £12.58 COVID in the other arm, one visit, you know, fee, and some of those practices might not mind picking that up, or they might not have capacity and they might hate the idea. I don't know, does that answer the question, Gandhi? I don't know really, but those are solutions that I could potentially see NHS England reaching for.
Yeah, so I guess that my perspective would be that, you know, it talks about PCN groupings. So it doesn't have to be the entire PCN that signs up to deliver the COVID vaccination enhanced service. It can be, for example, my network is 7 practices. It could potentially be 5 of those 7 practices to deliver it. And they can deliver it technically to any patient that rocks up to the centre, as long as they're covered by the footprint of that PCN. So does that mean that a practice could deliver the vaccination to one of their patients not registered in their practice? Potentially, because there is a mechanism within that, in the enhanced service, to do so. Does that mean that those PCN grouping practices take the finance for it? Yes, because they've done the work. Does that negatively impact the practice that hasn't engaged? Maybe, because then they won't get the flu vaccination elements of it, because the flu vax would have been given by somebody else. So similar to this concept of pharmacists doing it, actually the network grouping could potentially do that as well. So there is that risk to those practices that don't engage with it. They also not potentially lose their flu vaccinations to the pharmacy services or other services, but also to the PCN grouping itself. So I think there is a relevant risk in there. Is it the PCN's responsibility to make sure that the COVID vaccination happens? No, that's actually NHS England's, which they've delegated to the CCG's responsibility to make sure that it happens for the entire footprint. But as you said, that opens the door for other players coming into the market, and potentially more likely that would happen.
Back to the document.
Back to the document. Let's go for it.
Let's try and breeze through what's left. So yeah, care homes need to be arrangement in place to deliver vaccine to patients in care homes or who cannot attend the surgery. for their vaccines. So PCN groupings need to think about that. There's also a bit of an incentive around or incentive / compensation around delivery to patients in their own homes, isn't there, Gandhi? There's an additional £10 payment for certain named circumstances, but which generally appear to be designed where people have to go and deliver the vaccine at a different site to them that isn't one of the practices.
Yeah, so quite rightly, to deliver the vaccines to a housebound patient has additional resource costs, and as a result of that, there's an additional payment that's made. Is it more lucrative? It depends on how you do it, to be honest. I think if you have one clinician going out and hopefully delivering about 40 vaccines in a day, if you can manage that, for example, looking at care homes as a central located site, you could potentially make it quite lucrative to make sure that you've got those resources to share with the practices and other places. It all comes down to organisation, if I'm being honest, to make that work. So as long as the right organisation, there's some really cool websites out there that can help you coordinate visits in particular. I'll stick the links to those in the show notes once we've finished, because I need to track them out, but that might be helpful to practices and networks that are looking at to deliver that. Important point, you cannot do the housebound patients unless you're signed up to the enhanced service. So you can't pick and choose. It makes that very clear in the document.
And just an interesting point. I haven't seen the community pharmacy version of this document. I'm assuming there are similar incentives there, and this makes care homes actually potentially quite a lucrative environment, because you can send people there, move room to room, deliver a lot of vaccine, and you're potentially getting flu vaccine, COVID vaccine plus £10. So 30 patients for £30 for potentially for each of those patients on one contact. I'm just wondering if, Gandhi, have you found that community pharmacies have been contacting your care homes directly, seeking to sign them up for delivery of vaccine already to patients?
No, I haven't seen that yet.
No, we've seen that in our area, which is interesting. It just goes to highlight some of the tensions around community pharmacy, in addition to those opportunities for collaboration. But
again, different rules.
Yeah,
that's the issue. But
so so they're potentially, I think that's worth noting. So that's why we've highlighted that. Just highlighted some points which seemed relevant when we were looking at the document before, but I'm not sure they're all worth talking to. There's an expectation, obviously, to work in PCN groupings. A few of our practices are always quite hot on asking, okay, whose CQC registration does the site come under? Because if there's an event, a death, something goes wrong, whose sort of slate is that up against, in terms of, who takes the CQC rap for that. So we've asked that question locally, and it seems if it's co-located, particularly is the same place as a GP practice or is co-located, then it's likely that practice is the sort of registered manager associated with that site from a CQC perspective. Is that something people ask in your primary care network, Andy, or is that just a particular sensitivity in my area, do you think?
So I think in my particular network, being the registered person for this is actually the key issue. A lot of people are unsettled about the risk element of that, and obviously taking that responsibility because it requires an additional workload. Is it suitably compensated by the work that you're having to do? Possibly, unlikely, because we know other places have done this. So I think it is doable, but for some places, getting their heads around that responsibility aspect of taking on particularly additional CQC responsibility, I think is a real challenge for certain regions and stuff.
Yeah, good. So, and then this is all pretty bread and butter stuff, really, but obviously all of those involved need to sign up to a collaboration agreement. So we'd had some versions of that come out with the initial vaccination hand service, and we actually already signed up to those. I've heard on the grapevine that there's the potential for revised documents to be issued. I'm just wondering if you know any more about that, Gandhi. You may not.
I suspect that's just to take into account we're about 6 months on since those documents were probably originally created, so maybe worth just updating to make sure they're clear. Obviously things may have changed. So for example, in my network, one of the practices now changed into another practice because it's now moved to a new site. So obviously we would need to redo any collaboration agreements and stuff because it's now a different organization that technically is part of that network.
Yeah, true. Happened on my patch as well. So yeah, we need to get our heads around that. Naturally, those those collaborative arrangements are going to cover areas around data sharing and
Yeah.
access. It's important that the lead practice or the designated site or the PCM, but somebody has the appropriate arrangements in place for all of the bread and butter things about running the site effectively. Collection, storage, reporting on stock, utilization, communicating with patients. They've said that as a minimum, there needs to be a recall capability there. And one can see that primary care networks actually, through direct access to the patient records of participating practices, have pretty good recall and coding capability there. So I think that's an asset that that general practice has. As in talking to community pharmacy, it's something that actually they would love, to have everybody's contact details and to be able to search a database for eligible patients and so forth. So I think it's a real asset actually that primary care networks have arrangements for staff sharing and so forth. And of course, I think the financial arrangements around these enterprises could become a little bit complicated. You might have one lead practice in receipt of funding, for example, or at least a primary care network in receipt of funding, and there will be an admin burden for being that lead practice or the primary care network. And is some of that removed from the fee before it's distributed to practices or not? How is that covered? So, are things going to be shared in a timely fashion? It probably needs to be in black and white how the monies are going to flow. So yeah, a financial agreement is really, really important, I think.
Agreed.
Yeah. Subcontracting. So this is something I just pay particular attention to, just given that I'm exploring possibilities with the community pharmacists in our area. And it's actually reassuring to see that there is provision to subcontract. Clinical pharmacists are mentioned as potential people to subcontract to in certain areas. So one can see that model is an option for us in other areas. And people will always wonder about indemnity as well. And it does quite clearly say that the clinical negligence scheme for general practice, so that's the sort of statutory cover that we now enjoy in general practice, does extend to the activities of those giving the jabs. And it does say primary medical services delivered by a subcontractor, which I thought was quite interesting.
Okay.
It does depend on who that is, but I suppose an appropriately qualified subcontractor is covered.
I suspect that's to incorporate things like federations and that kind of stuff potentially, so then they can support practices with delivery of the mechanisms.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, but it's nice. It's nice to see that there, and I think that needs to be fully explored as people enter into subcontracting models, and they might want to get additional assurances on their own arrangements. But I thought it was nice to see that dealt with within the document in that way. Yes, I think these are all just bread and butter considerations in terms of running things. Really, you've got to model. There's a need to minimize usage and make sure that you're making use of what you've got, minimize wastage. So I think there's some sort of modeling requirements around that, and we're sort of trying to get the data to start to model that. There's a lot of unknowns in terms of demand actually and uptake for this booster vaccine. I don't know if what are your expectations about uptake, Andy?
So we modelled it based on what the flu uptake was last year, because I think that's a good marker of where you're likely to get, if not potentially over. So at least as a minimum, if you go off whatever your flu delivery was for last financial year, then that might be a good place to start with. So that's what we've done, because it's the same cohort basically.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And then so this is the question about co-administration. So I had a few people say, oh, it doesn't say you can co-administer in all circumstances in the document. But this is the paragraph that most specifically deals with co-administration. And my reading of it, it says that you should co-administer where possible. What's your understanding of co-administration? Because this was a big question in some of the webinars. People were asking, can you guarantee that you can co-administer? But it seems to be dealt with within the document.
Well, I think the part of the thing is that they can't guarantee that at this moment in time. I think the discussions are happening to say that this should happen, and they can't see it being a problem because they are seeing that actually there's a benefit to having both done. But obviously this is work within the domain of MRHA and other organisations to make that formal decision. Until we get that clear cut, yes, you can, but it is looking increasingly like it should be approved. So yes, hopefully. But as you said, it's not 100% in the document. And if there was to be the issue of it can't be co-administered, that obviously creates a significant logistical challenge when it comes to delivering the vaccines. And although people say, well, we've already got a situation where you go for one vaccine, you have the next one 8 days later, 8 weeks later, sorry. And we're already seeing problems with that, because some places where people are just walking into a walk-in centre where they're delivering them are having it after 3 weeks, which is pointless, because that reduces the protection you get from it. But then some people are saying, well, I've had my 2 vaccinations, 2 doses, and I'm covered, and blah, blah, blah. Obviously, this is slightly different talking about a booster, which is more specifically for the more vulnerable patients and things. But if you're thinking about flu and COVID, kind of vaccinations, there is potentially the similar issue that may come about. So hopefully it should happen, but it's not conclusive and 100%. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, the key phrase is where possible, isn't it? And I think that's actually about whether it's safe. I think the intention of NHS England is that it should be given together if possible, I think.
Like you say, I think the preliminary data says it should be, but they haven't got the conclusive stuff yet. So it will probably arrive in the next few weeks, as per most of this. Just like the supply chain, we don't actually know which vaccines we're going to get for another 3 weeks.
Yeah. So a lot of this is just operationalizing that I've highlighted here. So I think we'll just be very selective, as we've spent quite a lot of time on the document. But it's something that is really important right now. I think it's appropriate we spend time. Yeah, this was just, again, for those people where it's relevant, it's worth just having a look at some of the paragraphs about subcontracting. And actually, it does permit subcontracting delivery, which is reassuring for me and gives us more options in our area. So who are we doing? Well, okay, it's the boosters, but this obviously replaces previous enhanced services for delivery of COVID vaccine. So it is people who have not yet had their vaccine and want to have their vaccine from previous cohorts. So you do need to have a way of catching those people up, both capacity to do it and also a mechanism to call, recall, make sure they have them at the appropriate time. The eligible patient groups will be confirmed to us by the JVCI. I always get that wrong. No, that's right. At a later date, but it does give us an idea of the various categories and the order in which that they might be called. Again, this is just highlighting that we need to consider specifically PCN-linked care homes in our solutions. I'm sure we'll all be doing that. And that we need to provide good call, recall systems as a minimum. Essentially, a large part of the document is talking about just following the SOPs that are out there around consent, preparation, storage, and delivery of the vaccine. So this part of the document starts to cover that. There's a little bit of narrative around an expectation of increased problems with flu this year for the NHS, and just highlighting that JVCI has advised that over 50s get a flu vaccine going forwards for this winter, which we're all aware of already. You have to make sure that your staff are appropriately trained, that they are the appropriate type of staff and people to deliver the vaccine, and that you have the relevant PGDs and so forth in place.
Andy, just because of time, do you think it's worth going to probably the lower part about, because a lot of this is stuff that we've covered in previous streams in terms of the document and stuff. I guess the key one that I know some people are talking about is whether or not you leave the enhanced service. So towards the end of the document about withdrawal from the
withdrawal
service.
Yeah, we've highlighted some of that. That's absolutely right. I was trying to speed up, but it's such a long document. So withdrawal areas. So I think basically you need to give 42 days notice. That's what the document says.
As for the previous ones as well, that was the same time frame for the phase 1 and phase 2.
And you can withdraw. And there are various circumstances where, and they can obviously withdraw at 42 days notice. And there are circumstances in which they can stop you doing it if you are not doing it correctly or safely. And it can be varied based on ministerial discretion. So anything else in particular? I mean, this basically, it's clear about 42 days. It's basically my take home from that section.
And I think we talked about that, about the good faith element of, if you can't deliver it, then you can't deliver it. Therefore, you may need to leave the enhanced service. But I know there are some places that are talking about, doing it for a couple of months and then saying, well, we're done. obviously, as we mentioned, you would need a good reason to say that you're not going to be continuing for the full 5 months. So let's be clear, the terms of this enhanced service is from the 6th of September till the 31st of January. So it's just about 5 months in total that you need to deliver this scheme in terms of vaccinations to patients, both for obviously COVID vaccination and potentially co-administration of flu vaccination over that time. That probably sums it all up, doesn't it?
It does. John's asked about 15 minutes, and I just very quickly control F'd 15 minutes because I didn't actually see 15 minutes mentioned anywhere within this document, or I think it is within existing SOPs. But I think it's
15 minutes relates, if I'm correct on this, and feel free for other people to correct us afterwards or during this, it's related to the Pfizer vaccination in terms of those potentially that are driving. That's still been the key advice that patients who are driving should remain out on site for 15 minutes after administration. That's the reason why it's still there, and it kind of needs to be, because that's not a direction that has changed. Obviously, originally, way back when this all came out, it was suggesting that any patient that had a vaccination would have to stay on site 15 minutes. As we know now, that's not necessarily the case for all types of vaccination. And I think this is the key point that we need to be aware of from many places. A lot of the rules that are set out in the enhanced service are to encompass the fact that they don't know at this point what vaccination each site will be getting. So obviously there are different rules when it comes to delivery of AstraZeneca compared to Pfizer because of storage elements and stuff. And even though that has improved, particularly for Pfizer, still not at the same level it was compared to AstraZeneca. So because there are different processes and guidance in terms of how you process each vaccination, that's why the enhanced service has to encompass the fact that you may get any of those vaccines and how are you going to deliver it depending on which vaccine you get. Because at the end of the day, no one at this point has control of the supply chain. You know, we're even hearing obviously food supply chains in the UK are currently at risk because of all the Pingate and all that kind of stuff. How that's going to affect the vaccination supply chains is still unknown. So, you know, we just need to be aware that that's a reason why there are some of these rules that people are really upset about when it comes to delivery through practices of this particular enhanced service. And I know that's a contention we've had in our network. You know, if we get AstraZeneca, this process is so much easier compared to if you get Pfizer. And I can completely understand that, you know, NHS England, Nikki Kanani's team are trying to enforce the fact they would love to give us all AstraZeneca. We don't know if that's what we're having, though, at this point.
Gandhi, just for clarity, what's the position on kind of covered waiting area for 15 minutes? Obviously, don't drive, you know, 15 minutes after vaccination. Is there still a requirement for to hold people for 15 minutes observation after Pfizer?
I don't think so. I think if you are
I didn't think so, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, important to remember that technically social distancing guidance has changed as well now. You know, the 2 meter elements of stuff is less of an issue, although clearly we would still recommend people do social distance and follow all the other advice as per previous, although it's obviously not legally required anymore. But yeah, doesn't mean you shouldn't follow it, but there is adjustments that can be made there. I guess the key thing to look at now will be the time frame, because obviously
I was going to say, where do you want to go next?
Yeah, this is the key thing that people need to be aware of. So as we said way back when we started this session, which we've probably gone a little bit over the plan, it was simply the fact that, you know, the deadline, the first key deadline every practice needs to be aware of is on Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Your network has to submit to its local CCG whether or not the network is going to be trying to deliver a network solution for the COVID enhanced service at phase 3. That is the key deadline that everybody needs to be aware of. So as we said, it's just over 4 days from when we're doing this live stream. If you're watching this after that, well, there's still some other deadlines you need to be aware of. So there's the processing of the information from the CCGs to NHS England, and there's this 2-week time frame whereby CCG works with the local networks to figure out whether or not their plans are actually viable or not. What did you think of those deadlines, Andy?
Tight.
When do we ever get a deadline that is not tight? Let's be clear on that point. You know, having 2 weeks to decide if you are engaging with an enhanced service on this magnitude with so many unknowns, yet again, is yet again a challenge for general practice. I understand there are definitely some areas where this isn't a problem. As we said earlier, there's some places that are already doing this because they've been doing it for the last 6 months. But for those areas where this is new, this is pain and challenge and difficulty.
I was going to highlight, so this is like a real headache for primary care networks, which is now the unit level of collaboration within the NHS, particularly when you're trying to do all the other things which you're supposed to be doing as a primary care network in terms of bringing online new roles and services and all the other things. However, it's also perhaps an indication that primary care networks are useful. I mean, we've been able to pull together sort of 3 local meetings of GP practices at very short notice, where we've had productive discussion about getting people signed up for something like this at really short notice. And I'm not sure if that sort of thing would have been possible before primary care networks were created. So in some ways, whilst this is sort of leaning on and into primary care networks, it might be an indicator that actually, you know, they are effective if you want to do things quickly within primary care network or the NHS, within the NHS.
Yeah, I agree. I think they allow for the potential collaboration. I think the mechanism, still not sure on, to be honest. I think that the timelines need to be different, to be honest. You know, seriously, giving people 2 weeks to decide whether or not to deliver a mass vaccination program in their local areas with so many unknowns is just unfair. I understand that they're having to do this. The timeline is helpful. It makes it clear why they are having to do this. Because if you want to start this in September for co-administration with flu to make sure it's all up and running, it has to go pretty soon. Kind of makes you wonder how long they've been sitting on it for. Okay, there's that element of things. And, you know, it's not uncommon for us to have a week or a few days deadline for various NHS England documents at the moment. And it seems that that's become the routine, and that shouldn't be the routine. So, you know, I think there is that element that NHS England probably need to consider, that they are yet again leaning on any of the goodwill that general practice has, and we're working with them over and over again. And obviously, unfortunately, recently that has been eroded by several other actions NHS England have taken. But this is about patient safety, and as ever, general practice always meets the demand of patient safety far better than anybody ever expects us to. That's my personal view. But yeah.
And after the 28th, the ball is somewhat within the CCG's and NHS England's court for a period of time, as they seek to, obviously we're with primary care networks, so there'll be a requirement for some input from practice and primary care networks.
Although I think people like me and you are going to be working like crazy in the background to make sure that this all works, to be honest. So obviously CDs, networks, I can't see this being quite good for us.
There will be to and fro between the PCNs and primary care network, but there's a process of assuring that the sites are right, that the necessary measures are in place, and that's where there'll be a lot of work happening. And then readiness checks. So 13th of August is when the final decision is taken by NHS England and the CCG teams as to whether the sites are designated, the measures suggested are appropriate, etc., etc. Readiness checks during August, and then jabs in arms from Monday the 6th of September, or the ability to put jabs in arms. Will vaccine be available everywhere on that date? I don't know the answer to that, but jabs in arms from the 6th of September. So really, really tight turnaround.
Just over 5 weeks, practices have to be ready to go, which is, some people are probably not aware of how this works. They probably think, that doesn't sound too bad. 5 weeks is a huge amount of time. No.
Yep, it's scary, but there we go. And other areas of the country may not be, running quite as fast as we are here, because they may have done all this already. So yeah, Gandhi, where do you want to go for the rest of the episode? I'm aware we spent a lot of time on that. It feels like it was a worthy topic.
It was. I think we do need to cover the other area, but we're going to whistle through this because hopefully it's really positive news for general practice, and that's talking about the GPDPR elements of things. So for those practices that aren't aware, if you have somehow managed to miss this, obviously GPDPR is the new data sharing requirement, and that's coming towards the healthcare service in total. And there's a massive component of this which is using the GP records, which looks at type 1 opt-outs in particular, which is then submitted to the GP practice. And this is about sharing pseudo-anonymized data into a central server that can then be used for things like research and other reasons, as per the directive of NHS Digital. There's been some really positive elements of this, which is obviously the research that's been done with COVID vaccinations and all that kind of stuff. And one of the key ones that's repeatedly mentioned is obviously the positive use of dexamethasone for patients with COVID, and how that was realised through the information found through these kind of services. But it's updating it to make the process a lot more sensible, fluid, and potentially easier for different reasons. The reason why this became a huge problem is that from the original direction that came out in the middle of May, which had about, again, 5 weeks for practice and every patient across the country to realise what to do with their own data, was that the data would be extracted and used, and then you wouldn't have control of it after that point, because of the massive uproar this caused because of, say, patients' control of their own data. This was pushed back to the 1st of September. for the upload date. That still meant a really short time frame for practices and patients to understand what's going to happen with patient data. This then went to various different organizations and committees, and we've now had a letter. This letter came out on the 19th of July, so about 5 days ago, which has some significant changes when it comes to GPDPR. I think there's 4 changes in totality that really bear reference to. So where have we gone? There we are. So the first one is that it's a letter from Joe Churchill, I think it was, wasn't it, Andy? Right at the bottom. One of the MPs and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay,
there we are.
Parliament Under Secretary for Primary Care, Health and Promotion and stuff. And in this, they commit that actually, firstly, GPDPR upload has been paused, and it will be paused until they met particular challenges and until they have been satisfactorily done, of which there needs to be the option for a type 1 opt-out to delete the data once it's been uploaded. So this is, just up there. There we are.
Yeah, am I here?
Yeah, yep. Opt-outs. So first line on there, firstly, the patients don't have to register by the 1st of September. This is so that there's enough time for things to happen. Secondly, that any previous data that has been uploaded can be deleted if an opt-out is submitted by a patient. So previously, if you hadn't done a type 1 opt-out or the NDDI opt-out, which is the non-GP data version of this, it didn't matter whether you did it after the 1st of September or not, you couldn't get your data back. You couldn't pull it out. They've now said that that can't be the case. If a patient opts out, they opt out, and there has to be a mechanism for taking that data back out. And the other small part of this was that they were going to change the type 1 opt-out process anyway, but they've now delayed this for 12 months to make sure this process works a bit more sensible. They've given more time to clear the backlog of opt-out. So I think there's several practices across the country that suddenly had an influx of paper opt-out forms driving through their practice. And obviously, whilst you're trying to do business as usual, deliver, world-beating vaccination scheme and various other things, that's an additional workload that was not welcome. The third one that I really like is that they have committed to setting up a trusted research service. Trusted research environment. So this is basically making sure that whoever then accesses the data does it in a sensible and secure way. And this is working with other organizations like Open Safely to make sure it is appropriate. Because before there's a lot of suspicion that this is being determined by NHS Digital and patients could patiently have their data sold to organizations. So making it into a trusted research environment makes it a lot more hopefully secure. And finally, that they're going to make sure they do a bit more campaigning and awareness for both the staff and for patients to make everyone aware what's happening with their data. That is the talk now. Didn't read talk later kind of thing. Update of the document. I'd highly recommend reading it. It's only a couple of pages long, which is surprising for most of these kind of documents. But it does give a lot more, from my perspective, at the very least, reassurance about this. The only thing it doesn't have, which if you're asking for my wish list, is that this was changed from an opt-out to an opt-in. That would have been the thing that made this absolutely perfect, but they haven't done that. This may be as close as we're ever going to get to that, though, to be honest, in my view.
Yeah. Discuss. I mean, there's good things come out of the analysis of this data by research organisations, but we don't have time to discuss in too much detail. I'd love to see it part of the NHS app. The opt-in or opt-out process, and I wondered why that
the NDDI version one, the non-NHS data part, that is to a degree part of the NHS app ecosystem. So you can do that, but unfortunately, GP one has to be a physical form, according to what they were saying. Now, we may potentially be aware of ways that this could be adapted in certain practices, and we're looking at how we can deliver that to practices to help them with this process. So hopefully, we'll have that content coming out on the eGP Learning YouTube channel soon to give you the support of it, helping the patients do that a lot more fluidly, so then you don't have to worry about having paper forms and all that kind of stuff, and potentially being able to deliver it electronically, which could potentially make it a lot easier. But hopefully this process is, at least the deadline has been removed. This episode was all about deadlines. The deadline has at the moment been taken away, and they have assured that before any deadline comes again, that the appropriate documentation like the DPIA, which is still not surfaced, will be available for practices and patients to be able to see a sight of before all this goes ahead, which is, as I said, really positive news.
The deadline fairy giveth with one hand and taketh with the other.
Yes, it's like smack you one side and give you a cake with the other.
Oh, cool. Well, that was I would say that was a fun episode. It felt fun to me, but it was quite technical.
time went a bit quicker than we planned. For those that are watching us live, and if you are watching this on recap, one thing I really would love to highlight you all of, on the 4th of August, we are working collaborative with HTN, so the Health Tech newspaper, to deliver our digital primary care conference. I would highly recommend you attend this for a couple of reasons. Number one, we will be having Dr. Osman Bhatti talking about GPDPR and everything you need to know about data sharing and stuff. So that whole topic we've just talked about, he's doing a dedicated session on that. Absolutely recommend being part of that, because that will help to manage a lot of this kind of stuff for you. But in addition to that, we've got Dr. Nikki Kanani talking about the future of general practice. We've got Dr. Min Albakai talking about the future of digital primary care and general practice. And we've got some awesome other speakers and sponsors helping you to understand how to make primary care work so much better in the future. And the carrot on the cake, it's completely free. No payment, nothing like that. And if you can't make it for whatever reason, because obviously we'll be there, both me and Andy, you will, as usual, get access to all the recordings after the event and stuff, so you can catch up with it and things. And we're being supported by the amazing team at HTN. They're going to be basically making sure you get all the content as quickly as you can, to be honest. So we're really looking forward to this conference. Highly recommend you sign up. I'll put the links down below in the chat. But if you do want to go to it, it's bit.ly/HTNDPC21, all capitals, and sign up from there. And we will be able to basically have you join us for what is hopefully going to be an amazing conference experience for you. And this time, this one is completely free. Nothing to pay, just need to register, that's all. What do you think, Andy?
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm going to be there.
Yeah, so we're both there supporting and coordinating it all. And as ever, I'm absolutely looking forward to Nikki giving us her time and the opportunity that, you know, people will be able to ask her questions as well. So we've tried to bake that in. So if you do have any questions, let us know. We'd love to have the opportunity to ask them. We've only got half an hour with her, so, you know, definitely a busy person and stuff, but absolutely looking forward to this session. It's going to be amazing. So I guess the last thing just to mention is that next week Andy and I are going to be going live from a games expo, because we're both going to the UK Board Gaming Expo, and so you can join us as we do that. We hope you really enjoy it. It's going to be an interesting experience, because we're going to be live from not this environment, but from on
a real place with real people.
Yeah,
not socially distanced. Goodness me, it'll be crazy.
Yep, and we hope you find it amazing as ever. And as always, in EGP, we're here to help take enhance your primary care and learning. And we'll catch you in the next episode. See you later.